Hours after Donald Trump said he wants to wind down American participation in the war on Iran, bombs rained down on an Iranian nuclear facility. And Iran then hit back, striking a nuclear site in Israel. The first of many questions I have for my guest, Megan Sutcliffe, is after billions of dollars worth of missiles and drones have been spent in 3 weeks of war, does this one day represent the single most dangerous moment of the war so far? Before we dive in, let's take a bit of a look at Dimona. The town's located in the south of Israel in the Negev desert. Emergency workers there report more than 30 people were injured after a direct hit on the town. Crucially, a facility lies just outside Dimona that is believed to host Israel's arsenal of nuclear weapons, though Israel has never directly confirmed nor denied that it possesses them. Now let's bring back Megan Sutcliffe, security analyst for the Middle East and Africa with the consulting firm Sibylline. Megan, great to see you. Let's start by asking you, how significant is it that a missile has hit Dimona, a town strongly linked to Israel's nuclear program?
Good evening. It is certainly a very significant development in this conflict. Although we have seen the US and Israel engaging in airstrikes targeting a variety of locations in Iran, including nuclear facilities in Natanz and in Isfahan on previous occasions, this is the first time that we're seeing Iran explicitly targeting Dimona, which, of course, as you said, is strongly associated with what is believed to be Israel's nuclear weapons program. Whenever we see a penetration of Israel's air defenses, this is taken very seriously by the IDF. But the fact that a missile was able to successfully penetrate Israel's multi-layered air defenses and strike a location that is so close to one of the most critical aspects of Israel's security mix is certainly very concerning when it comes to the security of Israel's skies at this point in time.
Megan, even without a crystal clear picture of whether the facility itself was hit, how concerning is it that the strikes are getting this close to Israel's nuclear infrastructure? The fact it's a target at all at this point.
It is extremely concerning from a public safety perspective. Essentially, if we're seeing Iran targeting locations that are believed to house at least part of Israel's nuclear weaponry arsenal, that increases the risk of essentially those munitions triggering some kind of uncontrolled explosion within those facilities. Any potential uncontrolled explosion within a facility like Dimona increases the risk of that essentially triggering the nuclear weapon in its form, whether that is underground or whether that is in some other facility. At that point, we're talking about essentially somehow a second-hand nuclear weapons use in the context of an escalating war in the Middle East. Truly, it is an extremely terrifying situation.
Now, in keeping with this developing theme of tit-for-tat strikes, Iranian state TV say their attack was in response to an earlier strike on Iran's nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz. Israel's military has denied responsibility for that attack, saying they were not aware of any Israeli strike on Natanz. The Pentagon did not issue a comment. The International Atomic Energy Agency says it has detected no release of radioactive material in the aftermath of the attack. So, Megan, Iran is calling this a response to the strike on Natanz. Given the Americans said Natanz was obliterated last year, what do we know about this latest strike?
Well, it is a challenging information space to be working in. Of course, Iran already is a very challenging information space itself, and that's before we even consider the nuclear program, which has been shrouded in secrecy for many, many years. But essentially, when we're looking at the status of Natanz, we do know that it was targeted repeatedly by Israel during the 12-day war last year, which of course ended with the US engaging in Operation Midnight Hammer, which involved the use of extremely heavy munitions targeting Natanz and its hardened facilities. Now, US President Donald Trump repeatedly stated that Iran's nuclear program had been obliterated, that it didn't exist anymore. But this was likely a bit of dramatic license on his part. Those facilities continued to exist. We could see them from commercially available satellite imagery. But what exactly was going on within those facilities is very hard to determine. Iran suspended cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency as soon as the war began, and it didn't allow IAEA observers to go back to the 4 enrichment facilities that it has within its territory after the conflict ended. Essentially, this meant that the IAEA was flying blind when attempting to assess the status of Iran's nuclear program. So what exactly was going on inside, what happened to Iran's stockpiles, and whether or not it was trying to resuscitate its enrichment program. Unfortunately, we can only estimate as to what those actions were.
Right, so given what we know and what we clearly don't know, Natanz is, though, we know, often described as Iran's main enrichment site. How central is it actually to Iran's nuclear program today?
It's absolutely central because that and the Fordo enrichment plant were essentially the 2 centerpieces of the enrichment program, and one cannot develop enriched uranium without the centrifuges that had been found within those facilities. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that those are the only locations whereby Iran has engaged in research and development, for example. We know that Iran has fostered research and development in many universities throughout the country. There's also the dedicated Partian military nuclear complex just outside of the capital, Tehran. So they're not necessarily the only locations whereby Iran is exploring its nuclear options and potentially engaged in some form of enrichment, but they were certainly absolutely central to its capacity to rapidly develop large stockpiles of enriched uranium. And their targeting during both wars has likely reduced that operationality, at least in the short term.
We talk figuratively about a program being underground, but how difficult is it to actually destroy the facility at a facility like Natanz, given that it is literally underground?
It is certainly very challenging. It's worth noting that Natanz had above ground facilities and below ground facilities, and those above ground facilities had existed for decades. But the below ground facilities, essentially that were dug into the earth and hardened using concrete under many, many meters of earth, that only really started being developed in the late 2010s and the early 2020s. And so they are relatively well reinforced. That's why we saw the United States becoming involved in the 12-day war last year. Essentially, the Israeli government went to Washington, D.C. and made it very clear that while the IDF was able to engage in airstrikes targeting a variety of locations, including Natanz's above-ground facilities, it lacked the munitions and the aircraft capable of critically damaging those facilities that had been hardened, like Fordo, which was built into the side of a mountain, or Natanz that was built into the ground. It's extremely hard to destroy these facilities, and often the way that militaries will target them is by sealing them off, by destroying access tunnels so that it's no longer possible to enter or exit these facilities, rather than essentially blowing them up out of the ground. That's extremely challenging to achieve from the air. So what we're looking at here is likely a further attempt by possibly Israel or the United States to restrict access to those facilities, to make it impossible to access and resuscitate them in the event that Iran was attempting to rejuvenate its nuclear program.
Right, so stepping back, how effective are these kinds of strikes then in setting back a nuclear program? They're trying to restrict access to the facility itself. Do they achieve that, or do they actually risk perhaps hardening the resolve of the Iranians here and even further still dispersing these operations? Is that a possibility here?
It's absolutely a possibility. That's something that has often been at the core of questions as to whether or not to engage in airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear facilities. Essentially, Iran's regime viewed the potential development of nuclear weapons as something that deterred attacks against its territory, much like how its development and support for Lebanese Hezbollah, it was attempting to deter Israel from engaging in airstrikes targeting its own territory. Essentially, though, this strategy failed, and we saw the ambiguity regarding the nuclear program leading to a deadlock in negotiations between Israel and the United States on 2 occasions. It's important to contextualize that, though, that occurred under the former Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, who also issued a fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons. But now we're not speaking about a regime that's being led by Ali Khamenei. We're speaking about a regime that is being led by his son, an individual who has lost his father, his wife, and one of his children as a result of Israeli and US airstrikes. And so when we're looking at the strategic direction that Iran will be setting, at the moment, it's possible that they will interpret these airstrikes as being evidence as to why a nuclear weapon is so necessary to act as a deterrent against Israeli and US airstrikes going forward.
Megan, one more really interesting development is Iran demonstrating it still has long-range missile capabilities by attempting to strike the Indian Ocean military base of Diego Garcia. Britain has sovereignty over the island, which hosts US forces there. Neither of the missiles managed to hit the target, which is nearly 4,000 kilometres into the Indian Ocean. Megan, Diego Garcia is a long way from this war, and Iran appears to have used longer-range missiles for this strike. Is that in any way upending what we knew or what we thought we knew about Iranian capabilities in this regard?
It does, to a certain extent, I would say, push or stretch our understanding of exactly how capable Iran is with reference to its medium and long-range ballistic missiles. Essentially, it was assumed that after the 12-day war last year, that Iran's capacity to develop the type of munitions that would be capable of reaching locations like Diego Garcia, but also major cities in Europe, for example, had been disrupted. However, the fact that they were able and willing to use at least 2 missiles to attempt to reach Diego Garcia is certainly concerning, because it means that now Iran has demonstrated it is capable and would potentially be willing to use these type of munitions should the conflict escalate further and draw in further conflict parties. If we were to see European nations like France or Germany directly engaging in airstrikes targeting Iran or potentially deploying naval assets to the Strait of Hormuz, Iran could now credibly threaten to target the mainland of these countries with its missiles. And although on this occasion they did not reach Diego Garcia, they did not result in any injuries or any damage, we can't guarantee that that will always be the case, particularly when we're talking about locations in Europe that are clearly closer to Iran than Diego Garcia.
So a strike or attempted strike on Diego Garcia, Natanz as well, tit-for-tat strikes. What does this last 24 hours tell us about how this conflict is evolving?
It tells us that the appetite for airstrikes targeting a variety of locations within Iran on the part of Israel and the United States is only growing. We're seeing repeated targeting of nuclear facilities, of naval facilities in both the Persian Gulf but also in the Caspian Sea. And we've seen particularly Israel engaging in airstrikes that routinely target the domestic repressive apparatus of the Islamic Republic. So police forces, the Basij militia, for example. And while all of that is in keeping with the war goals that Israel set at the beginning of this conflict, and ones that have also been repeated to a certain extent by the Trump administration, when we're looking at the way that this war is being prosecuted, it's becoming increasingly clear that Iran will continue to respond regardless of the costs that are inflicted on its territory. We have seen responses to the Israeli airstrike targeting the South Pars gas field as essentially Iran intensifying very briefly its hostility targeting oil and gas facilities in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia. And damage to the Ras Laffan liquefied natural gas plant has meant that this facility is now considering cutting production for the next 5 years because of the damage that has been inflicted to it. And that was only in 2 rounds of missile attacks. Imagine what happens if Iran scales up that response, if it sustains it over several days. The impact that that has on the global economy, on the way that we live our lives and do our jobs, could be absolutely deleterious. And so the concerning aspect of this conflict is that Iran shows it continues to be willing to respond. And as long as the US and Israel keep hitting, it will respond in kind.
So you raised the issue of goals here. It's a really important one. I want to ask 2 more before we go. With that in mind, goals, what will you be watching next to judge for yourself whether this campaign is succeeding or escalating further to that sort of scenario that you're talking about, escalating beyond control, perhaps?
Well, I think that when we're looking at the way that this conflict is going, essentially it tends to be primarily dictated by the actions that Israel and the United States are taking. And so in terms of achieving their conflict goals, the United States has made it very clear that its goals are to essentially eradicate Iran's conventional military capabilities in terms of its missile program, its drone program, but also its navy, as well as removing any capability to develop some form of nuclear weapon. If we were to see the US engaging in very high-profile airstrikes targeting hardened nuclear or naval facilities, then that would potentially be something that the Trump administration would attempt to use as evidence that it had achieved its war goals, that essentially Iran had been forced to capitulate, even if that type of statement wasn't necessarily forthcoming from Tehran. However, on the other hand, when we're looking at Israel, essentially what we have seen over particularly the past 2 weeks is a continued emphasis on the idea that this airstrike campaign is being used to lay the foundations for an environment that would be conducive to a popular uprising and regime change. That's something that's much harder to quantify. It's not exactly guaranteed that we would see Iranians once again coming out onto the streets into an extremely dangerous situation in order to possibly try and overthrow a regime that through the past 40 years has maintained a grip on power through harsh repression and violence. That means that it's relatively challenging to establish as and when Israel will decide to dial down its campaign. Although US President Donald Trump has said that he believes that Israel will be ready to, quote, end the war when the United States is ready to end the war, there's no guarantee of that. And if we also consider the fact that the US is currently surging Marines to the region, essentially units that would possibly be capable of seizing territory, such as islands in the Persian Gulf, that again pushes us towards this increasingly flexible grasp on what exactly the US aims to achieve in this case, and particularly when we're looking at an Iran that is still ready, willing, and able to respond in kind.
I want to finish back where we started, if I could, with what I think is a pertinent question. With all of that in mind, the goals and where we are in this campaign after 3 weeks, does this single day represent the most dangerous moment of the war so far?
I think that when this war ends, as all wars eventually do, we will look back at this day as potentially being one that was a major inflection point. Essentially, the active engagement by Iran of Israel's nuclear facilities is extremely concerning. Israel is not going to take this lightly, just as it does not take any penetration of its air defenses lightly. And so the risk is that over the coming 24 hours, we will see Israel potentially doubling down, intensifying airstrikes in Iran even further, targeting more and more nuclear facilities in an effort to deter further attacks against the Dimona area. The risk is, though, that, of course, Iran does exactly the same thing. And so I think that this is almost certainly a very significant day and one that we will remember when we're looking back at this conflict when it ends.
Megan Sutcliffe, brilliant. Security analyst for the Middle East and Africa with the consulting firm Sibylline. Thanks a lot for taking the time to unpack what was a truly significant 24 hours. Great to have you on DW. Take care.
Thank you.
So, with Iran's attempts to attack Diego Garcia and these new strikes on nuclear facilities, what do you think? Is the war escalating to new heights? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And because you've made it this far, like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Bye for now.